Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Cool, perfect. Okay, I'm Martin. I've come all the way from Berlin, Germany to talk to you about cljdoc today. And actually, I forgot to press the button. I also want to try some poutine. People told me poutine is amazing. I've never had poutine. I think it looks a little gross, doesn't it? But yeah, I'm into trying new stuff, so take me to try poutine sometime maybe. Okay, so cljdoc is a documentation platform for the Clojure and ClojureScript ecosystem. And I started working on cljdoc in January 2018. And in the beginning, I wasn't quite sure if it would be possible to create something like cljdoc at all. And so you could describe the beginnings as humble, I guess. But now I'm actually quite proud of what it has become, and that's what I would like to share with you today. And the reason I'm giving this talk is that cljdoc is one of these things that people have to use for it to provide value. Like, it's only useful if people actually use it, if that makes sense. And yeah, so I'm giving this talk so you know what you can get out of cljdoc and to sort of raise awareness what it can do for the community. And so the talk will be structured in 3 sections. At first, we'll talk a bit about what cljdoc can do for you. Then we'll talk a bit about why I created it in the first place and how it works, because as I mentioned, I wasn't quite sure in the beginning if it would be possible to do something like it. And so there are some interesting aspects to that. And then last, we'll talk a bit more about what you could do for cljdoc if you're interested in sort of making this project or improving this project. Now, what can cljdoc do for you? For this part, we'll go through a couple of demonstrations, and I will show off some specific libraries and the documentation for those specific libraries. But keep in mind that everything I'm showing applies to every Clojure library that's out there. Like, none of this is specific to the libraries I'm showing, and all of this is available to every Clojure library and ClojureScript library in existence. So let's go to GitHub and take a look at a project that some of us might know, NREPL. NREPL is a client and server for a networked REPL. You may know it. And the NREPL team has done a great job of incorporating their documentation into cljdoc. As you can see there is this little badge that says cljdoc 060, I think, something like that. Do you see that? Yeah. The video actually doesn't move on my screen, so I'm like guessing a bit. And the nice thing here is that, people can just click this button and they get to the documentation. And whenever the NREPL team publishes the new version of the NREPL library, that badge will update and it will say 061 or something like that. And something that's not quite obvious just looking at that badge is that in the background there's like some system running that will watch out for those new releases of NREPL and will build the documentation in an automated fashion. So the NREPL maintainers don't actually have to like run something to publish the new documentation or something like that. It will all pick up the moment they publish it to Clojures. And because that build step may also sometimes fail, there's a multitude of reasons for that. Ideally, it doesn't fail, of course, but sometimes it does. And so if it does, there is these error state badges as well, so the library author easily sees that something is broken. All right, so let's jump into some actual cljdoc documentation and not spend more time on GitHub. What you can see here is the cljdoc documentation for NREPL. On the left side, you have a bunch of articles. You also have namespaces, and we'll talk about all of that in a moment. The articles are provided through a very simple Eden file in the GitHub repository of NREPL. And the format of that file is a little bit inspired by Hiccup, you could say. And I'll just show it to you quickly. for this page we just saw. It kind of looks like this. I hope you can read it. And it's this Hiccup-inspired structure that describes a hierarchy of articles. I think it's pretty straightforward if you're familiar with Hiccup. If this doesn't make any sense, don't worry. It's not really important to understand that in full. OK, so the list of articles is provided through this data structure that's part of the GitHub repository. And you can see there is a bunch of source files. And so let's take a look at one of these articles and how they're actually rendered and what they look like. In this case, we're going to look at the server usage article. And you can see there is like code blocks, there's syntax highlighting, there's tips, there's warnings, there's danger. And in general, there is a bunch of stuff. And the NREPL team uses ASCII-doc for all their documentation. So they have access to these advanced features, you could call it, which are these little tips and important callouts. If you've ever used ASCII-doc, you might be familiar with them. But like if you're only familiar with Markdown, that's something that ASCII-doc provides over Markdown that's not available in Markdown. And I think in many ways, ASCII-doc is a little bit superior to Markdown, but obviously also Markdown is simpler, and there's good reasons to use Markdown as well. Both are fine, but I think these warnings and these little things are really nice to guide the eye of the consumer of that documentation through the documentation and make sure they see that they are not supposed to run their NREPL network server on a public port. Stuff like that. Something you can't yet see is that at the end of every article, there's a link to edit the documentation on GitHub. And I think with documentation, you generally want to make it as easy as possible for everyone to contribute documentation. And so having this link at the end where people can just click it, they're immediately brought to the source file, they can fix a typo, they can update a keyword that has changed from version 1 to version 2, something like that, is really useful, and removing these little, or removing this friction in the contribution process for documentation hopefully makes all of us end up with better documentation in the end. So API documentation. You've seen on the left that there were namespaces as well, and I think that's also like something interesting to talk about, so let's talk about that. But let's not talk about NREPL for that, and let's talk instead about RUM. I'm glad Nikita is sitting here. I didn't spot you before. And I've used RUM, or I've been using RUM in a client project recently, and so I viewed the cljdoc documentation for RUM not too long ago. And in this case, cljdoc provides a little handy tool inspired by Slack and similar apps where you can just hit Command-K, and you will be able to switch to other documentation. That kind of looks like this. No. Well, it looks like this. I'm not sure why this didn't work, but yeah, you can press Command-K, you get there, and now we can jump into the RUM core namespace and take a look at some extra documentation. And what you can see here is that there's links in the documentation, that the doc strings are formatted fairly richly compared to maybe some other tools you've been using. And that is because everything is interpreted as Markdown. So now I'm going to lobby for Markdown. I think Markdown is a great format for doc strings, and as you can see in this case, it's really handy to provide like an example of how you call a function, how you're supposed to do stuff, and it really helps to read that kind of stuff. Some other people have used lists, all that kind of thing, and that's all pretty neat and makes it really easy for the user, for you to read documentation and to understand how you're supposed to use stuff. Something that you might have spotted that's not immediately obvious or that might be new to you is this little gray thing above the list of all the vars in there, and that says mostly clj/s. Does it say vars or forms? I think it says forms. And that is because Clojure or cljdoc actually is platform aware. So all the documentation you will see on cljdoc is for Clojure and ClojureScript if the library supports both of these. And Rum is an interesting example for that because Rum targets Clojure and ClojureScript. So you can use Rum on the server to render stuff to like HTML files kind of, and you can use it on the client as a React wrapper. So obviously there is going to be some differences between that, but you want to keep the API almost the same, or you want to keep it you actually want to keep it identical, so you don't have like different code paths for how you render this stuff. And the way this is done is that functions that are specific to the reactive part, the React wrappering part of Rum, are a little like mocked out in Clojure. And the author of Rum has done a great job of sort of indicating that in the doc strings. Here we have the React and reactive bits. And you can see that there is a different doc string for Clojure and ClojureScript. And you can see that in Clojure, this is a simple deref. But in ClojureScript, it actually works with the reactive mixin and will reactively update the component whenever the ref you're passing to that function changes. And so I think that's something that's novel in the Clojure documentation ecosystem or something like that, and that hasn't been there before. All the other tools like Codocs and Autodoc and all that have been targeting one platform, and if everything is the same, that's fine, right? But sometimes not everything is the same. And so you can also see on the left side there is this one function, DOM_node. Obviously, that doesn't exist on the server side. You cannot get a DOM node on the server side and do something with that DOM node. But you can do so on the client, and so it's nice to see that this is only available in ClojureScript and not in Clojure. Okay, so the next bit is versioning. And that's something that may seem minor to you or minor in general. Did something play already? No. What's going on? I don't understand Keynote anymore. Okay. I just pressed left and right for a minute, and then it worked. Great. So what you can see here is that like all the documentation is versioned. So for Rum, there's like version 0.11.2 and 0.11.3, and if you view the old documentation, it will point you to the new version, and all the links generally to cljdoc will always be pinned towards a specific version. So there will never be this point where you look at documentation and you're like, oh, is this for the version I'm actually using, or is this like master that has been refactored like 3 times and is actually not the release that was done like a year ago, or that kind of thing. And so that was kind of important to me from the beginning, that everything is versioned. Something else you can do is you can download documentation. Okay, now it's working again. That's great. And that allows you to just download a zip file of all the documentation. So if you're in a hammock or something, you can look at that zip file. It contains all the articles. It contains all the namespace, documentation, all that kind of stuff. And that will actually be the foundation for something else we'll be talking about in a minute. All of this is also available on mobile. I have no idea why you would want to use it on mobile. But it works, and it bugged me for a while that it didn't, so I just kind of went ahead and did it. And some people mentioned they use it, but I honestly don't understand what for. But that's good for them. Okay, so the downloading is actually the foundation for something I'm going to talk about now. And before we talk about that, I just wanted to ask who here is familiar with a Mac application called Dash? Okay, are you all using that as well? Yeah, okay, so you're not just, you have not just seen it, okay. So for those who are not familiar, Dash is a documentation lookup application, you could say. On a Mac, you can like bind it to a global hotkey, and then it pops up, and you type in maybe conj or something, and it will bring you to the documentation for the conj function in Clojure core. And the interesting thing is that it's not just for one language or one ecosystem, but you can use it with Java, Ruby, JavaScript. You can even use it with Java libraries. So I use JGit a lot, and I regularly look up like commit reference object factory stuff. It's really nice to have this one consistent interface to look up documentation across all these different ecosystems that you're working with. And yeah, I wouldn't be mentioning this if cljdoc was not available in Dash. So if you're using Dash, you can also get all Clojure library documentation inside Dash now. And here we're going to search for DataScript and maybe some Ring library. And in the background, Dash will download the same artifact that we just downloaded like a minute ago. And it will sort of massage it into Dash-specific format that allows you to then search for it. And here we search for DataScript core. All the stuff is formatted as you would expect it to. The links within the documentation work. There's this little overview on the left where you can see all the functions in a namespace. It's really quite a handy tool. And then there's also this interesting aspect about it that you can set custom prefixes. So I use that a lot, and in this case we can set like a ring prefix for the ring documentation, and then we type in ring : and we search for a wrap, and then we see all the wrap functions in ring core. And I think that's really quite handy when you work with like one library very intensely. Okay, and I think, oh yeah, and all the articles are included as well. So you really like, you don't just get API documentation, but you really get the whole package, like all the documentation that is available, and all of it will be searchable. Okay, so this concludes what cljdoc can do for you. And now let's move on to why cljdoc exists and how it works. So as I mentioned, I started to work on this in January 2018, and that was prompted by a lot of discussion around documentation tooling in the Clojure Berlin community in December 2017. And the interesting thing there was that some people started to work on tooling to make publishing documentation easier, but we all also realized that the tools we were creating, the scripts or the little helper utilities, were all just band-aids for a problem that ought to be solved in a different way. And what we all understood was that in other language ecosystems, there were tools that did this much better. So in the Rust ecosystem, you have docs.rs. In the Elixir ecosystem, you have hex.docs. There's similar stuff for Dart and Go and blah, blah, all these other language ecosystems. And talking about it, we all kind of realized like having something like that for Clojure would be sort of the end goal compared to just like having a bunch of scripts that generate HTML files and put them on your GitHub Pages branch. And so after looking at these tools from those other language systems, I realized that these tools achieved two things, and they subsequently also became the goals of cljdoc. And the first goal was to free up library maintainers' time so that they can actually spend time on documentation. So if you're now a library maintainer, or if you were a Clojure library maintainer a year ago, and you wanted to publish documentation for your library, you probably went something like, okay, Googling Clojure library documentation publishing tool. And then you found Codocs, and then you edit that, and then you configured it, and then you tried to figure out how to make source paths work, and then you published it to your GitHub Pages branch, and then that didn't work for some reason, and then you tried it again, and then it worked, and then you published a new release and forgot all about this. And then you have to figure it out again. And so I think there was a lot of like time spent on this meta stuff around publishing documentation that was not actually documentation. And these tools all enabled that people like don't have to do any of that anymore, and instead can spend like all of that time on, going to the park with their family, or maybe even writing documentation. So just to restate that, goal number 1, make it easier for library authors to publish documentation, allowing them to spend more time on actual documentation. And goal number 2 is not about library authors, but instead about users. Something else these tools enabled is that they provided a central place. Every user could go to this one thing, and they could find the documentation for any library they were looking for. If you, again, try to find documentation for a library a year ago, you might go to the project's GitHub, you might search for like API docs, and they would all be scattered across the internet, different GitHub pages, domains, different stuff everywhere. And that, just wasn't a very nice user experience, I guess. And people also sometimes added like custom CSS files, used different tools to generate the documentation. The documentation looked different. People had no idea how to navigate it, all that kind of stuff. And so goal number 2 is to provide and evolve a consistent user experience to find and view Clojure library documentation. So the idea here is that whenever you want to look at documentation, you go to cljdoc, you find documentation. It always looks the same. You always get the same format. You always get the same navigation. You always get the same look. And also, whenever people work on improving cljdoc and ship a new feature like that little quick switcher thing I showed you earlier, that will be available to everyone using that documentation, and it won't require that people update their documentation tooling generator to take advantage of that kind of stuff. Okay, so far, or that's about the why bit. Let's talk a bit about the how. And the interesting thing here is that with the other tools I mentioned for Rust and Elixir, these languages have type systems, they have static analysis tools, and we have macros. And macros are, if type systems and static analysis are here, then macros are like where Tiago is giving the other talk in the other room. So what people can do in Clojure is this kind of stuff. So here this macro would define 2 vars, A and B, mapping to 1 and 2. And you could imagine that macro could even like do a network call, or do whatever kind of weird stuff. Like if you've used Amazonica and understand how Amazonica generates its API, that's kind of like this kind of stuff. And so one problem with creating something like these tools for Clojure was that Clojure is super dynamic, and to be able to extract this API information, to extract a doc string, a list of arguments, all that kind of stuff, you effectively have to run the code. And running the code is a problem, because running the code means that if somebody comes along and thinks, oh, I could mine Bitcoins on this thing, or I could run Selenium and click some ads and I'll be rich in a few hours, that's kind of a problem, right? People could abuse that you kind of provide computing power to them. And when I started to work in cljdoc, I wasn't quite sure like how to solve that, and I looked into Docker and Kubernetes and all these kind of fancy things. And in the end, I came up with something that is a majestic hack, but has worked amazingly well ever since, and I'm just going to describe that to you. So whenever a user comes to cljdoc and wants to build some documentation, or whenever the NREPL team publishes a new release to Clojures, cljdoc will pick that up, and it will, instead of running that analysis, instead of loading that code on the cljdoc server, we will start a Circle CI build through Circle CI's programmatic API. And that's kind of where all the magic is happening, because now it's not our problem anymore. And it's Circle CI's problem. And they are the people that deal with this problem like professionally on a daily basis, and we don't have to think about it. And so we run some code in CircleCI, and if that code succeeds, if there's no problem, if there's no missing dependencies or stuff like that, the build will succeed. We store that information in a build artifact, which is like a file you can attach to the build, and you can download later on. And then we feed that back into the cljdoc database, where we can then use it to render HTML pages and all that kind of stuff. So that's how cljdoc sort of circumvented that isolation trust issue of working with an ecosystem that is open to everyone. And the rest of how cljdoc works is actually fairly straightforward. It's like a Pedestal server. It uses Integrant. It uses Hiccup. All the data is stored in SQLite. SQLite is amazing. I wonder if that will ever fall on my toes at some point, but we'll see. And then just to be a little buzzword compliant, we also use Terraform and Nomad for some DevOps stuff. All in all, it's about 5,000 lines of code. Last time I gave this talk, it was 3,500, so there is a tendency here, but we'll see how that evolves. Okay, I hope this gave you an idea about how cljdoc does its magic, and now we can move on to talk a bit more about what you might be able to do for cljdoc. And yeah, cljdoc is a community-run project. Obviously, it's open source. There's people working on it in their free time, all that kind of stuff. And so I think it's important that to constantly recruit people to sort of help with it and improve it in ways they deem valuable. And you can help in a couple of different ways. And I'll just describe those ways and give you an idea of how you might be able to help. The different categories I would put those in is outreach and awareness, improving cljdoc, and sustaining cljdoc. And what I mean by outreach and awareness is kind of the stuff I'm doing right now, right? I'm giving a talk at a conference. I'm talking to you like, hey, this is cljdoc, it's great, use it. And you might be able to do the same at a local Clojure meetup. You could tell your friends about it, that kind of stuff. Maybe you have a mailing list or maybe a Twitter account that has a bunch of Clojure-related followers that might be interested in that kind of stuff. And as I said, cljdoc is only ever going to be useful if people actually use it. And before people can use it, they need to know about it. And that's kind of where you come in. And then another thing that might go into that bucket is adding badges to projects. So if you're using a library that has documentation in cljdoc, but that is not yet sort of linking to that documentation, pointing its users to that documentation, consider adding a badge to the README, opening a PR. It's super straightforward. You can find the documentation for doing that very easily. And usually my experience with doing that is that library authors were just not aware and are actually quite happy to accept that change and sort of, oh, I don't have to worry about that anymore. That's great. And then last, you can help and improve library documentation. And so there is some stuff where libraries don't, or there is a list in a doc string, but it's not formatted perfectly for Markdown rendering. And so there you might come into play, and you'll be like, oh, okay, here, if we add 2 spaces here and there, then this will render very nicely in cljdoc, and that kind of stuff is also very helpful. Here are 2 PRs that did just that for Loom, the graph library or a graph library for Clojure, I should say. Somebody added the badge. It's removing 10 lines, adding 5. I think every library maintainer loves those PRs. And then another one by Anthony Galea, who did a lot of work on the Quill doc strings recently, and really took them to the next level, making use of Markdown, code blocks, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so improving cljdoc. As you might have guessed, this mostly is around contributing features and fixes and all that kind of stuff, like actual code or documentation or, working on the project. And there is a couple of interesting things that I want to hint at here. And if you're interested in any of that, like, just come up to me later and we can talk about any of that. Or maybe you have some ideas on your own. Okay, so cljdoc tomorrow, with your help, hopefully, could have some of that. Maybe all of that, maybe some, maybe nothing. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in here, so I'm just going to talk about a few of those. One thing is spec. So since the very beginning of cljdoc, people have always suggested that, oh, you should integrate spec. Like, that would be really cool if you could see, the shape of the data that a library expects and stuff like that. And, we have spec and people use it, and it's kind of like would take that to the next level, I guess. And I would be very excited to do that. Unfortunately, there are still some changes in spec or some preconditions in spec that aren't met yet, notably like metadata features that are missing that allow you to understand where a spec has been defined in what source file. And so there is some stuff that needs to be done there, but I think that's really, like, spec could be really interesting, because if you think about it, like, spec kind of, it's not a type system, right? But it attaches names to different things, how things are structured. And in the Haskell world, there is this search engine where you can search for functions mapping from one type to the other. And if we would have a database of all the specs in the Clojure ecosystem, you could imagine that we search for functions that map from spec A to spec B and get kind of the same thing. And I think that's kind of an interesting premise that deserves to be explored more. Another thing that I find interesting is automatic changelogs. And what I mean by that is not that human changelogs are bad. Human changelogs are great, and I in no way intend to replace them. But because we have all this data in a database, we can just diff version 1 with version 2. And whenever a function was removed, or whenever an argument was removed from a function, we can be like, hey, that's a breaking change. And that can be really useful for library authors, as well as library users, to see when stuff breaks and when their expectations may be violated. And then there's a lot more stuff. Examples is one thing. Interactive examples would be taking that to the next level. A lot of talk has happened around that. I think examples are pretty tricky because if we would add them, they would need to be added in a way that they're runnable. Because if they're not runnable and testable, ultimately they will die and like sort of bit rot and be out of date and not work anymore, and just cause more work for the library author. And causing more work for the library author is kind of the opposite of cljdoc. Yeah, there is a ton of stuff. Like, if you're interested in contributing, check out the issue tracker for cljdoc. There's a bunch of issues marked with good first issue. If you're interested in working on any of them, feel free to hit me up. I'm happy to mentor you through like understanding the code base and getting up and running and all that kind of stuff. Happy to spend some time with you on that. Okay. And then last but not least, sustaining cljdoc. Just putting that in here because I feel like I should. There's an open collective for cljdoc. There is like obviously some server costs. It's not too much. I think it's like $150 a year or something like that. So, yeah. But yeah, I mean, there is some cost associated with that. Stickers is one thing, very very important. And if you want to chip in with that, you're invited to. Okay. Before we end this, I want to thank all the contributors to cljdoc so far. There is a lot of faces on these slides, but there is a lot more people that have contributed good feedback and interesting ideas as well. And cljdoc would be nowhere without all that back and forth and the interesting discussions and code contributions as well. And then I also want to thank Clojure Together for funding part of that work on cljdoc, I think maybe 3 months ago or something like that. If you're not familiar with Clojure Together, they sort of collect money in the interest of the Clojure community, and they distribute it to Clojure libraries that are used in that community in the hopes of making them better and more sustainable. And then last but not least, thanks to you for listening to me. And I think if anyone has questions, we can do questions. Yeah.
So this tool is fantastic and definitely fills a huge gap. And I love the comparison to like Rust and Elixir. And I think the reason it works so well over there is because it's at the language level. And so like the buy-in across everything is super necessary. So I'm like wondering what your thoughts are for sort of consuming all these repos that don't necessarily have a config yet.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So. Oh yeah, I can restate the question. Okay, so the question was how, or in Rust and Elixir, everything works very well because it's on the language level. I'm not entirely sure I understand what you mean by that, but I think I understand the second part of what you said, which is how is this going to work for projects that haven't been configured for it? And the answer to that is that I obviously messed up my talk because there's no configuration necessary. And everything is just going to work without configuration. So what I showed you earlier, this file with the articles, right? Like that's the only bit of configuration you can do. For like the API stuff, for seeing what namespaces, what functions are in there, you publish your library to Clojures, you make sure you packaged it correctly, and you're golden. Yeah, like part of this project was always like the moment a library author has to like move their finger like one bit, that project failed, right? Like it is like critical that this works without the library author even knowing about it. Okay, I hope that answers the question. Cool. Any more questions? Yeah.
So maybe I missed this in part of the talk, but I'm wondering, is there any way you can search within source code to get answers to some of these questions? Because sometimes library authors don't document things, and we find ourselves actually going through the source to figure out what's happening. So
there is links to the source everywhere, as I mentioned, like, and you can jump into that. So there is an easy way to get to the source, but there is no way to search the source as is. I think like tools like cross-CLJ, if you're familiar with that, have existed before, and they're more on the source level, and I think that can be useful. But really, like I didn't say this time, but like part of cljdoc is also like if you as a library author see, oh, there is like this nice page with all this documentation for my library, but my documentation really sucks. Maybe you're a little bit inclined to like actually fix that. I think some people might have made that experience, so I hope that like by having this tool, maybe we get away from the situation you're describing, where you're like, oh, there is no documentation, I'm just going to read the source a little bit. But yeah, if you need to read the source, it's easy to get there, but there is no designated way to sort of work with that, or no, yeah. You're back to reading the source, I guess. Yep. Any more? Oh.
So, quick question. A lot of this is aimed at open source libraries. Is it possible to spin up an instance of cljdoc in an internal cloud system and run against like our closed source systems? Because great documentation is good everywhere.
Yeah. Of course it is. In fact, I've worked with a company in Berlin that wanted to do exactly that, and I made some changes to cljdoc to sort of make it possible and everything. And if there's interested in doing that, you can hit me up and pay me for it. Okay. Okay, good. Cool. If there's no more questions, okay, one more. I mean, I guess we have a lot of time still, but yeah.
So how are you thinking about projects that already have a documentation site or other kinds of docs like blog posts or more like tutorial style docs?
Yeah. Good question. I don't have a very good answer to that. I think the article structure that I described on the left is good for kind of like a guide, right? But what you're saying is more there has been something, somebody wrote something about it at some point, like a recipe kind of situation. And there in cljdoc there's no special way to deal with that. Either you can integrate that into the hierarchy on the left, and maybe have one page that contains all of these, or maybe you have a page that links to other places or stuff like that. But there's no specific facility to integrate that kind of information. And I think that to some extent that's also okay. But yeah, I mean, that's a bad answer, saying, that's okay, that's no problem. Okay, more questions?
Would it be in keeping with kind of the spirit of cljdoc to add more features for encouraging better docs, like having scoring on docs and stuff like that?
Yeah, totally. I literally discussed that with a bunch of people, and there is a lot of interesting stuff that you could do there. One thing on the contributing slide that I didn't go into was the highlights. So, for instance, one thing we've been talking about is, if there is a function that is exceptionally well documented compared to the rest of the library, maybe there is a value in highlighting that function and sort of steering the user toward that function. And then also stuff like you said, you could give a library a score. Does every function, every public thing in that library have a doc string? That kind of stuff. That's would totally be in the spirit of cljdoc and shaming library authors into writing better docs. Yeah, I obviously don't want to do that, but yeah, it was too good of an opportunity to not say that. Okay, more questions? No? Okay, thank you very much. If you want a sticker, find me.